I would like for people to look at Black people as a source for the culture of the United States, the main source of culture. Not so much because of the drum, which I think is so basic, because it's the heartbeat, and because our languages were taken away, that we went to the heartbeat, which was also the drum of the culture from Africa, and created language for this country. And out of that, a creative voice for this country, a way to talk, yes, about race, but race is small. I became interested in theater at Howard University. And I like to tell this story because I entered theater literally through the back door. I was a history major, and I had always liked public speaking. When I was in school in Washington, I was in a play and I would do narration and so forth. So I considered it a kind of talent of mine. I like to get in front of people and speak. And I was getting a little bored with history, and I walked by the theater one day at Howard, and the back door was open. And I walked in onto the stage. And the director, Owen Dotson, who is the writer-director of the Howard Players, said, where you come from? And I said, where am I? And he said, that's a good voice. We need somebody to lead the chorus. And they were doing Medea, and he made me the chorus leader. I'm just out of the blue like that, but I felt so at home. Then joined the Howard Players at Howard, and from then on I got very much interested in theater, and I changed my major I added, so I had a double major when I graduated, theater or drama it was called, and history. Well, I stayed around D.C. for a year or two, and had a government job, and then I decided I wanted to go to New York to act. Now this was the early 60s, but I followed my impulse to go to New York to act. What did I have, what business did I have doing that as a young Black woman? But I just followed my impulse. But immediately I started auditioning, and off Broadway in small studios. And I got work acting. There were a few people there from Howard, actually. Michael Whitaker was the director already. He graduated from Howard, and he hired me at a place called La Mama, which is now a well-known theater generator of work. Things like hair started at La Mama and so forth. But for me, anywhere I could work, I would do it. And once you step on the boards, people see you and then they hire you. So it was almost natural and unafraid at that time. But it was a generation of people. We were looking at theater, now they call it theater for social change and so forth. But I had been a history major. I had studied Black history at Howard. And so I was always interested in using theater to talk about things that were socially relevant. And one thing, when I was at Howard, we did Dutchman, and Amir Baraka, who was then Leroy Jones, came to see it. And he came back, and I wasn't even, a character, but I was on the subway in Dutchman, and he said, "You have presence." He came back, and he said, "You have presence." And I learned later that presence was a quality that actors have to have. But so that was enough for me. As Amir Baraka said, or Leroy Jones at that time, he said, "I have presence," so that must mean something. So I had a lot of encouragement, and it was an era wherein people were breaking barriers, and so I joined the throng. Some years later, I was asked to read this new play, these poems that a young woman named Ntozake Shange had brought to New York. She had been doing these poems out in the West, in San Francisco. And she and Paula Lark, who was eventually the choreographer, had driven across country, and Oz Scott, who she'd found, who happened to be by then I was teaching at NYU, and Oz Scott was a student at NYU, and he had these poems and gathered a few actors to read them. And I say this in one of my plays, that I was so busy I chose not to do the play, but I did read the first opening of just the actors, and play opened off Broadway, then it went to Broadway, and Trezana Beverly got the Tony Award for the part that I had read for. And then she left, to do other work, and I was brought on. At first I was understudy for all the roles. I had done all the roles by the time I got The Lady in Red, which was the featured role. And it was an amazing experience. He came out of the Harlem Renaissance poets. He was a friend of Countee Cullen and Langston Hughes. And so he was of that era. So when I look back, I think of myself in the tradition. But I was always interested in what was new, what was experimental in theater. And for me, Black theater is part of that way of looking at creativity. I found that Black culture is endemic to America. There would be no American culture without Black culture. We all know that now, but it took me a while to kind of put it all together. And then I realized, I said, oh, I am in the tradition, because I was always interested in how to make from who I am. happened to work with innovative playwrights like Ntozake Shange, especially like Adrienne Kennedy, who might be known for Funny House of the Negro. It's her main play that is well known, but she has quite a body of work. And her work was very experimental, African-American woman. And I was fortunate enough to do original roles in 2 of her plays. And as an actor, what you want to do is do the backstory. And the backstory for me was always personal. How does the character that I'm doing reflect something that I can connect to myself? And in that way, it was innovative. I mean, everybody's doing it now, but to make my story the play. And I also wanted to challenge, anything people say you can't do. You can't make a character of yourself. And I thought, yes, I can. And so I started telling my story, my family story. And that was how I started writing. Well, the main story that I started with was a piece called My Father and the Wars. And it was my father was in the World War II. But it also turns out the next piece I did, it was an extension of that called Indian Blood. And my grandfather was in the 10th Cavalry. He was a Buffalo soldier. And so I thought, who's telling this story, And so it turns out that my aunt, who's my father's sister, had all these papers about my grandfather being in the 10th Cavalry. And so I wrote their story, my father's wars, and I had a lot of tension with my father generationally because I was in the 60s and I was all, anti-Vietnam and all of that, and so, but, after my father passed, I realized, he had a story. And so I started to write out of that sensibility. And how I wrote was to just take excerpts that I remembered and some dialogue and some words and some things that how parents say things over and over, and they stuck in my ears. Okay, so I'm a diabetic, and I'm a juvenile diabetic. But one aspect of that diabetes, which I talk about in the piece that I wrote, is denial. And somebody said, why don't you talk, you're so busy, using yourself to teach others. Why don't you do a piece about diabetes? Nah, that was years ago somebody suggested that to me. When I feel like you can't, I shouldn't, I always turn that around and say, that's something that I'm resisting, And so I said, this is what I'm doing. I got to talk about it. I studied with a woman by the name of Kristen Linkletter, who taught voice. And her way of teaching was to get the body and the breath involved in producing the voice. And I studied with her because I was at the Negro Ensemble Company first, in terms of being connected with the theater company. I wasn't a main actor, but I understudied. And Kristen came there. She's from England, Scottish, and she wanted to train American actors to teach her work, and especially black actors, she said, because we had a kind of resonance in our language. You know, it's a generalization, but still, I got it. And I studied her form, and then she suggested that I come to NYU to teach. And I didn't even have a master's degree at that time. She said, you know, you're able to teach now. And there was a program. You know, so much of life is luck. You know, so much of success is luck. You have to be prepared when a door opens. But there I was. And then while I was teaching at NYU, I was just teaching the voice work. And Lloyd Richards, who was the director of Raisin in the Sun, pulled me aside one day and he said, you're teaching the voice work, but are you teaching people how to talk? Because Kristen's work was in some ways abstract. You know, we did the voice and the resonance and so forth. And so I thought, okay, I'll figure that out. And I started doing projects at NYU, getting people to use the voice work in order to articulate their own stories. So I've taught. I taught at NYU for about 10 years, and then I took off for a while and performed. And then I went back and I taught at Mount Holyoke for a couple of years. Then at Trinity College, and then for many years at Emerson College, from which I retired. I wrote out of acting. I started to educate out of both those things. If you're teaching something, you want to put it on its feet. What about the women? And I remembered the story of my great-great-grandmother, Sally, whose children were by the white man on the plantation, and that was a general story because so much of that happened. And I wrote a play called Sally's Rape, and it was just an experiment. How do you get people from the stage to talk to the people in the audience about something that they don't want to talk about? And it was a dialogue between myself and a white woman, although one of the lines in the play is, why don't you tell your story? No, this is time for my story, you know, so I used her almost as a foil to tell my story, and it was great working with her because I wanted to have the dialogue so that a white person is talking and listening, and the audience, therefore, is given a forum and an example of being able to talk. And of course, nowadays, all you hear all over the place is, we have to learn how to talk about race. And I said, been there, done that, you know. But, well, the Obie Award was a good thing to get. I also got a Bessie Award for the same performance piece. These were grants. We did another woman and I did a piece where we went to 3 different locations. Boston for about busing, the desegregation of schools. We went to Mississippi about the voting rights, and we went to Los Angeles about the riots, so-called rebellions, as people also refer to them. And so we made a piece in Boston called Turf, a piece in Mississippi called Mississippi Freedom, and we made a piece in Los Angeles called The Other Weapon, which it was about the Panthers actually, but the Panthers also had another weapon. Instead of guns, they had community action. Well, I know nothing about Virginia. I mean, I was born there. My father was in the war when I was born, and he had to go to war because although he was from an Army family and it was draft and everything, but he got in a fight with somebody, a white man, and they said either go to jail or go to the Army. And so he went to the Army. My father, they expected to have a boy. That's why I was named Robbie, because he's Robert, and she didn't like the name Roberta. And so my very early time was in Georgia, and every summer we went back, and they had the signs. You know, that's what we grew up around, colored and white. And we were fine down there in terms of family and neighborhood, and you know, we didn't have nothing to do with white folks unless you went to the store. But I knew, because I lived up north, that that wasn't supposed to be. And I knew in my lifetime it would change. But by the time I got to college, I realized, you know, that we had to make the change. And growing up in D.C., like I said, we went up south where they didn't have no signs. You just had to know where not to go. To me, I felt like we had to make the change in our generation. There's a writer by the name of Augusto Boal, and he's the theater innovator from, I hope I get it right, Brazil. And he says that all theater is political, and if you don't think it is, that's your politics. And the idea that, you know, there's something separate from art and politics is just, that's that politics. I work with, and this is someone who should be known, who's not well enough. Gloria Foster, she was in The Matrix, that's how people would know her now. I saw her soon after I got to New York. I said, I want to be like that. And then I had a chance to work with her in a play by Adrian Kennedy, who I mentioned earlier. And Gloria Foster played my mother, and I just feel like, okay, I can die now. Morgan Freeman, not we, but I mean, he was a star, and I was just an extra in a play with him. I worked with, in that same play, that was Shakespeare. It was a Black and Hispanic Shakespeare company. Denzel Washington was in that. Gloria Foster was also in that. Samuel Jackson, of course. And so, you know, we've touched some of the illustrious people. Lori Carlos, who many people in the field know. Jessica Hagedorn, she's a writer now. She did performance. We all did everything. Owen Dotson was an influence. And Joseph Chaikin talked about experimental theater. He's well known for avant-garde theater. I mean, he wouldn't like that label put on him, but he was mainly experimental theater. Black Panther. It's amazing to see the energy, the expertise, and the collaborative work, the the creativity, the connection to the past. These are the things that I wanted people to learn and know and to make work out of, and it's happening. I think it's a very positive time. I think the world itself, in many ways, the old guard are going crazy, and hopefully we can get them out of the way and survive with all the problems and climate change and so forth. But our young people, and to me they're young, I mean they're grown-ups, but they're taking the reins, and that's the good news. All the criticism will always be there, but the good news is that I feel like the future is in good hands. Really follow your impulse. That's what the voice work did for me. Follow your impulse. But you also have to know who you are as an individual, as well as who you are with your family, your community. Follow your dream.